Welcome everybody to my first of probably going to be a few series on flip fluids. Today we're going to be trying to recreate this scene right here. Now this is actually a pretty cool little scene, and I was going to start off with doing the waves that I had previewed a few days ago, but I decided that it might be better off to start everybody kind of from a more simpler standpoint, and that scene right there is pretty easy to create. Creating more or less realistic waves takes a lot of time and a lot of rebakes. Even with flip fluids, it still takes a little bit of tweaking. So we're going to start off with something simple, and we're going to go ahead and make that. And it took me about 20 minutes to make that, and probably about an hour with the bake and rendering, which I will post the video right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Assuming you already have flip fluids installed. If not, I might do a follow-up tutorial, but it's pretty easy. You just install the zip as you would any add-on. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and scale up this cube to 8, and then I'm going to scale it on the Y by 3, or maybe I'll move it to scene 3, or just myself. Sorry, let's try that again. I'm going to scale it by Y by 3, and then scale it by X by 2. And I'm actually going to go ahead and press 3 on the numpad and go into edit mode. And we're going to raise this up. You don't have to do it this way. You'll get a little bit different effect, but I don't particularly like when the waves come crashing down and hit the ceiling, so we're going to raise the ceiling up a little bit. Doesn't really matter how much you do it, as long as you raise the whole thing up. Now we're going to bring the whole entire domain up, and this is just like regular fluids where you are working with a regular domain. Although one of the more wonderful things about flip fluids is that if you click on flip fluids and then click on your domain tab, it immediately makes it see-through, which is great. Turns it into wireframe. Something Blender internal fluid simulation I wish did automatically. A lot of things are going to be very similar to Blender internal fluid simulation, as you would expect with flip fluids. Sorry, I did not record or plan any of this out. I'm just going to do it on the fly. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add our cube, and this is actually going to hold our fluid object. And I'm using a little bit different of a keyboard, so I do have to occasionally look down. We're going to press Z to go into wireframe mode, and we're going to go into edit, and we're just going to go ahead and select each one of these vertices, and we're just going to delete the face. Edit out of there, or tab out of there. And then we're going to go down to solidify to add some thickness, but I'm going to do the offset in the positive, and we'll probably do maybe 0.05. Yeah, let's do 0.1. Yeah, okay, there we go. And we're going to go ahead and apply that modifier. And the reason why we're making it thicker is water cannot really, the object is so thin that the water will just pass right through it, so you have to have a little bit of thickness to it. So you go to your physics tabs, and we're going to make this our obstacle. The main things that you really need to worry about, expanding is if you would adjust in case you have fluid leaking through. If you have a very complicated mesh, you would want to expand it a little bit. It doesn't actually expand it on the render. It's just more of a for flip fluids to expand it to make it a little bit tighter. Friction is exactly what it sounds like. It's how much friction will happen on the edges of, or on the faces of your mesh. And then white water influence. Now, this actually, you could do white water with Blender fluid, and I even did a particles tutorial on it. The reason why I like flip fluid so much is there's more control over it, and it is immensely easier. I mean, you could just click one and done and call it a day. These other two, inverse, I've never really had a lot of luck with this. Every time I use it, the few times I've gotten it to do what I want, it's just not that great. But it basically flips the inside of the mesh out. You won't really need that, and by the time you do need it, you won't be reading or listening to this tutorial. Export animation, it's exactly what it does. It exports the animation of everything and then does the baking. It's not really ever necessary. I think I've used it once, and I think it was just more of an experiment. Okay, So that's about it. Oh, the whitewater influence is how much bubbles and foam and all that. But we'll get into that in more detail when it comes to creating the waves. Right now, we're just going to set this initial scene up. So I'm going to hit 3 on the numpad, and I'm going to bring my container down a little bit longer, a little bit lower to the ground so we don't get so much splashing. If you want crazy effects like they had in the video, then you can raise it up and it'll come down and just create a big splash and all the edges will go up like that. And it's cool to do it the first time, but it wears its course pretty fast. Okay, so we're going to press Shift S and we're going to click on cursor to selected, and that's going to bring your 3D cursor here. Shift A to bring in a new cube, and you can probably hear my kids screaming in the background. And we're going to press S to scale this up, and I think that's pretty good. I'm actually going to go ahead and bring this down. A few things I didn't really particularly like about that scene was how much it splashed. So I'm going to bring down this cube as close to the bottom as I can. And then I'm going to scale it by pressing S and then Shift Z so we don't scale it on the Z axis anymore. I'm going to give it a little bit of space so we have a little bit of disturbance in the fluid itself. A trick, if you don't want any, scale it to the exact size of the object. And I'll go into more detail about that when I do the wave simulation. But now I'm just trying to give the new people out there an idea of how to work with flip fluids. And also, you don't need to ever click on this fluid here, but you can actually intermix two different fluids, flip fluid simulation and the Blender internal simulation programs. You can have two different water simulations going at the same time, so you can set the domain colors to different colors and you can have two different colors of water that way. It's kind of cool. Just know that the two will never interact. They're two completely separate baked objects. When I say baked, I mean the calculations for the water simulation. So we're going to go ahead and click on our cube here. We're going to change this to fluid. Now what the fluid is if you're brand new to fluid simulations, it's just a set amount of fluid. There's not going to be a lot of it running. There's not going to be more coming in. It's going to be one amount. So just remember that. This is the velocity for the way that the water is going to actually move. For an actual fluid object, I don't really see a big point on it. Most of that you'll leave alone. If you did target, it would kind of creep towards a certain object. Okay, so we've got all that set up. Now we're going to go ahead and click on this. And we're going to press I over enabled because we're going to make it to where the water is going to sit down in the box until about frame 40 and then it's going to just completely disappear. So then it's going to come down and splash just like it did on the original video. So we're going to, oh, whoops, it looks like I'm already on frame 20. So let's check that and hit I again. Then we're going to go ahead to our timeline there. We're going to uncheck this and we're going to press I. And remember in Blender, you could actually keyframe everything. I is keyframing. So there's not a lot that you can't keyframe in Blender at all just by hovering over it and pressing I, or if you're on this screen on your viewport, you can select all of these there. The most common would be location, rotation, or lock rot. You can also do scaling if you were to do scaling things if you're really into animation. I'm not a huge into animation. I want to be. It's just something I haven't had time to learn. Okay, now the last thing we're going to do is going to be the easiest part. And we're going to go ahead and just create a couple of cubes. And I'm going to press 3 on the numpad. We're going to put it down here at the bottom. We're actually going to scale it up a little bit. And we're going to scale it by pressing SZ. I apologize if I'm not calling out every single keystroke that I'm doing. But I'm kind of hoping that you guys are somewhat familiar with Blender at this point. We're going to select obstacle. And we're going to leave the friction to 0. I like it to really slide right off. I don't want it to create a whole lot of friction, but we're going to increase the white water to kind of create more of a different, well, white water. You create your bubbles, your particles that fly everywhere, your foam, all that good stuff. We're going to go and duplicate this one, and we're going to move it here. We're going to move it back. I'm going to do one more. I'm just going to kind of offset it here, and then press 3 on the numpad, and we're just going to change a few quick things here. Make this one a little bit taller. Go to this other one. Make that one even taller. And then we're just going to move it back. Okay. And since we copied each one, all of our information should be about the same. And that's actually going to be it. Not too bad. Now all you really need to do is baking. Oh, we can go through the bake settings. That I need to do. So there's a lot of settings here, and it could really throw a lot of people off. I mean, I remember the first time I opened Flip Fluids, I about cried. The first thing I discovered was presets. I was like, oh, great. You can make everything look beautiful. And it really can. I mean, they have done a fantastic job with their setups. I haven't really looked, but I think they probably have even more materials. And this will actually not only change the materials that are applied to the fluid itself and the particle systems, but it will activate the white water simulation when you click apply, and it will change its consistency, its in the thickness and all that of it as well. So if you were to pick something like copper, it would be less pliable, it would move a lot slower, etc., etc. So we're going to go ahead and click that add to stack. Now when you do that, it's going to automatically change your resolution to 300. This isn't set in stone. You could do 400. I think the highest I did was 900 at 500 frames, and it was like a bake of 300 gigs and took 2 days. It was stupid. Never do that. There's no real reason to do it. And you probably want to stay with this 300 because you feel like you have to, but you really don't. The difference between 100 and 300, or 200 and 300, are so little, and the time it takes to bake it all, it's not even really worth it. For this scene, we're just going to go ahead and set it for about 225. I mean, I do recommend, if you're really trying to show off and make it look as crisp as possible, 300 to 400 is a good place to go, but you're not going to really notice a big difference. And then we're going to go ahead and save where you want to save it in your cache. I probably shouldn't save it there, but for the purpose of this, I will. And that's really about it. Now, a couple of tips that I'm going to tell you about, and this is just part one of the video. There's actually going to be a second part as well. Another tip that I always try to do is don't bake your full resolution right away. There's no reason to do it. It could take, I mean, as much as 20 to 30 hours to do a bake. So start off small. Start at about 100. Bake the scene, scrub through the timeline as it happens. That way you can see if it's doing what you want. Now, I will say with higher resolutions, it's going to have less errors. I mean, because each particle, imagine that if you had resolution of 65, each particle is going to be this big. And you go, well, that's no big deal. And then you go to 400, and each one's going to be this big. Well, when you have really complicated meshes, the smaller resolutions will perform better versus a big resolution where, like, here's your box, and you have a 400 resolution there, and it's sticking out of the side of the box, and you go, well, why is it spilling over? Because it's the particle system it's just too big. So if you have that issue, then you could raise the resolution, but always start with a low one. So if that way you can tell if it's good, if it looks correct. If you start off so high, you're going to spend 3 or 4 hours baking your simulation, and you go and check in frame 60 and 70, you go, oh, this looks like crap. Then you have to redo the whole bake. So if you do a lower resolution, you can get the bake done much quicker, and you can see if it looks good, then you can do your normal bake. And like I say, for the most part, if you're just playing around with it, don't bake anything higher than 250 until you're really, really, really happy with it. You spend a lot of time, and I've wasted a lot of time trying to rebake things over and over again, and I still rebake plenty of times. Okay, so that's actually going to end it for the first part of this tutorial. I am going to make this a two-part where we're just going to slap some materials on here and kind of adjust a few things. I'm not actually going to adjust the materials of the fluid yet. The one that comes with Flip Fluids, it looks nice. It looks great. I really can't complain about it. I like to tweak mine a little bit, though. I don't like the way they look exactly, so I like to play around with it a little bit and just tweak it. And from here on, if you guys want to play with it, this could be all there's going to be of this tutorial. We're going to walk through just setting up the lights and everything. Oh, look at that. Blender just crashed. Hopefully when you guys clicked bake, it didn't crash. Anyway, we'll see you in the next video. Okay, so I'm back after that beautiful crash. I should mention that I actually use a daily build because I render on an RTX card. And I'm not a big fan of 2.8, mainly because it's in beta. Once it becomes publicly released, full version, I will probably switch to that. But with that being said, everything that I'm doing here will still apply to 2.8 or Eevee renderer. So with that being said, make sure you always save your scenes. Okay, and I recreated the scene pretty close. The only thing really left to do is to actually go ahead and bake out the simulation, and I'm going to save it first before I hit that bake button. Okay, so once you hit bake, it's going to just calculate it all out. And it really will depend on the speed of your computer. I run a pretty decent computer, so it's not too terribly bad. It'd probably take about 20 minutes, I'm guessing, for this scene. Yeah, it says 14. Usually what you have to do is you have to wait that 14 minutes, and then it will tell you the actual time, because this is probably going to take about 40 minutes to completely bake. Once we do that, we'll go ahead and we'll go into the next video on applying the materials, and maybe we'll change up the fluid material, but I don't think we will. I'm just going to go ahead and scrub through the timeline real quick here. We're going to go ahead and hide this box from the viewport and from the render. Just make sure everything looks good, and actually it looks pretty good. So alright, we'll see you in the next video.